the outcome of the summit was a declaration and a declaration action plan. And that declaration action plan is the one that is going to be guiding the work of BRICS for many years, to come. On the next slide, it just shows the meeting that was held. And at that particular meeting, which I did not attend this particular one, but they addressed and evaluated the challenges of global economic recovery, given all the experiences that people have with regard to economic challenges around the world. They also formulated the post-2015 development agenda to say this would be the things we'd like to put on the agenda as other countries are actually developing, so that at least there's a coordinated approach of BRICS countries to do this. They also looked at that address the political instability and peaceful settlement of disputes, so that these issues must actually be dealt with effectively. There are quite a lot of challenges, and I will be talking about them a little bit later in terms of some of the political conflicts that are being experienced in other parts of the world. And they also address the question of multilateral governance, issues, including the other, agreements that I will be talking about a little bit later. The next slide just shows, President Zuma as he was addressing the meeting, and he was really talking about a whole range of things. But one issue that I thought was important to mention was the fact that he indicated he was looking forward to partner with the BRICS countries as South Africa implements the National Development Plan. So there was a pretty clear link between what South Africa is actually wanting to do by 2030 in terms of the National Development Plan, especially in terms of infrastructure development, and what the BRICS countries were actually agreeing to do. On the next slide, I just want to say that on the next slide, the BRICS summit in Fortaleza, when they met, all of these countries were beginning now to have a shared view on a number of things. Most of the time, people used to think of BRICS as individual countries, but together as a collective, they actually have views that they are sharing on the whole issue of global peace. What should we expect in terms of global peace? On economic stability, on social inclusion, on equality, between nations, and equality even within countries, on sustainable development, as well as on the question of mutual beneficial cooperation, which goes beyond the BRICS countries but covers, many other countries, which is encouraging to see that BRICS is not just a monolithic entity that is not really working closely with other parts of the world. It actually aims to actually do that. Now let us look at the next slide, which talks about achievements and in reaching out, to other economies. BRICS, as I indicated, has gone beyond the intra-BRICS, cooperation, and it has expanded itself to Africa, as well as now of late to South America. Some of you might remember that South Africa recommended that BRICS and African Union should meet in South Africa when we had the 5th BRICS summit in Durban. And they did meet, and one of the things that they discussed was the question of developing Africa, sustainable development for Africa, and in particular the issue of infrastructure development, which is important in order to be able to promote economic growth within the African continent. The second meeting that took place is the one that happened in South America. There, the idea was for BRICS and South American states to talk about developing partnership in enhancing multilateralism and international cooperation for the promotion of peace, security, economic and social progress, as well as sustainable development in an interdependent and increasingly complex globalizing world. On the next slide, I try to address some of the social policies that BRICS deals with. Most people, when they think about BRICS, they only think about economy. They do not. They may not be aware of the fact that BRICS is changing over time. We're beginning to see a change in the nature of BRICS itself. It might have been coined as an economic group, but now it's beginning to look at the broader issues that are going to help not only to stabilize the global economy, but also to foster job creation, to reduce poverty, and combat inequality. These are the big issues that are of big concern, because poverty is still very rife, inequality is still growing, And BRICS is committed that it needs to address this inequality that is growing. Now, BRICS is really planning to play a significant role in promoting social development and in contributing to the development of the post-2015 international agenda. And we hope that through this they will be heard as the bodies are busy discussing this at the United Nations. Now, the next slide shows that it's not just a question of, here are the social policies, but they are prepared to be transparent in monitoring themselves as to whether are they, as countries, actually implementing this. One of the decisions that has been taken as part of the declaration was the instruction given to the National Institute of Statistics and the Ministers of Health and Education that they are to be supported by the BRICS Think Tank Council to examine and report on the feasibility of a platform for the development of core methodologies for social indicators. So what BRICS wants to do, it wants to be accountable, and that is why it's setting up systems that will allow for that transparent monitoring and performance of those social policies. BRICS is prepared, to bring together the policymakers, the academicians, the statisticians to work together to assess the extent to which these policies are being beneficial in terms of inclusive growth, including decent work, as well as reducing poverty and attaining peace, and so forth. So it's important that this should be quantified, made available, so they can be held accountable for the policy positions that they've taken. On the next slide, it deals with some of the principles that are governing economic policies. BRICS is saying, well, if things were working very well, there would be an alternative economic policy, which has got some 3 key principles, which are going to govern the global economic, policy. One is that there has to be universal country rights, equal opportunities, and fair participation in global economic, financial, and trade affairs. The situation is not like that at the moment, and BRICS would like to see this happening. The second one is that there has to be an open world economy with efficient allocation of resources, free flow of goods, and a fair and orderly competition to the benefit of all. And the third policy is that there must be an open, inclusive, non-discriminatory, transparent, and rule-based multilateral trading system that everyone must be able to understand and be able to participate in it as a country. So the next one is really looking at the question on governance of multilateral institutions in terms of policy. One is that, as I indicated earlier, that BRICS is committed to the UN, to reform of the UN, to reform the UN Security Council, and to make sure that it's more representative, it's efficient, it's effective, and most importantly, it's responsive to the needs, of the countries. China and Russia are actually supporting Brazil, India, and South Africa that they must play even a bigger role in terms of international affairs and support their aspiration to play a greater role in the United Nations. And then, of course, you all know about they are interested in the question of the reform of the World Bank and then the reform of the International Monetary Fund, which I talked about a little bit earlier. The next slide talks about their position on peace and security. It's actually an alternative policy, and that it's based on mutual trust, on mutual benefit, on equity and cooperation, and addressing the causes of conflicts, whether they be political conflicts, economic sources, or social dimensions. They are interested in seeing a different type of world. They're interested in looking at gender perspectives, that gender must be brought to bear in any conflict prevention and resolution and peace building, peacekeeping, rehabilitation, and reconstruction efforts. They are interested in condemning unilateral military interventions and economic sanctions which are in violation of international law and universally recognized norms of international relations. BRICS is interested in that no state should strengthen its security at the expense of another. And that's a very, very important point that we should be looking at, because some of the countries are involved in some of the wars to say that I'm actually trying by all means to protect my people, but doing so at the expense of others. And BRICS is saying no to that. BRICS is also saying that they would like to see, to promote, support, and protect human rights, including the BRICS, inside the BRICS countries themselves as well as globally. So they are not expecting better things for others and not, for their own citizens. So at least that's why I'm saying that that's an alternative policy, and it's encouraging. And because of the conflicts that are taking place in Africa, in Guinea-Bissau, Madagascar, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Southern Sudan, in Central Africa, and Democratic Republic of Congo, they would like to see changes that includes, ensuring that presidential elections do take place, that there is stability, that civilians are not caught up in all of this, that hostilities must actually be ceased. And they are looking for the similar thing when it comes to other parts beyond Africa. On the next slide, where they talk about Syria, and they are saying that, it would be good if at all, well, not it would be good, they are really encouraging that there shouldn't be any military solution to the conflict in Syria, that the conflict in Syria must actually be negotiated, that the human rights violation by all parties must end, and they do condemn the use of chemical war in that particular area. And fortunately, there are some movements that are positive in terms of beginning to address the chemical war in that particular part of the world. They also address the issue of the Israeli and Palestinian, conflict that is currently gripping, that particular part of the world. And they are recommending that they would like to see a two-state solution with a contiguous and economically viable Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel within the mutually agreed and internationally recognized border based on the June 1967 lines which were drawn, at that time, with East Jerusalem at its capital. So they're very clear in terms of what it is they want to see with regard to Palestine, resolving the conflict between Palestine and Israel. They also made comments about Iran's inalienable right to peaceful use of nuclear energy. They said you should be able to have nuclear power as long as you are using it in a manner that is consistent with your international obligations. And that is encouraging to see that they would like to see them, follow what the international laws require them to do. On the next slide, they still call for peaceful resolution of conflicts, obviously in Afghanistan, and that Afghanistan is emerging as a peaceful, stable, and democratic state. That's what they would like to see, that it should be free of terrorism as well as extremism. They also express concern of what's happening in Iraq, and they would want to see the government of Iraq upholding its national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And they are concerned about the war in Ukraine, and they do want to see a de-escalation of the conflict and finding peaceful solution. And they believe that there should be no justification for terrorism and condemn financing and supporting terrorist activities. On the question of the position of ICT, BRICS is suggesting that the internet should actually be used for peaceful means, and it should be used for economic development. It should not be used for spying and all of that. And they also suggest that, we should use ICT in order to combat, cyber crimes, make sure that there's no cyber crime that is actually taking place. They condemn the acts of mass electronic surveillance and data collection of individuals all over the world, as well as the violation of sovereignty of states and human rights, in particular the right to privacy. This obviously has been a big problem since the Snowden issue. Everyone is actually concerned, about that. Yeah. On climate change, I think here that's one area where a lot of work would need to be done, and I hope that the BRICS Think Tank Council will be working much harder on the question of climate change, because it's not as well developed in terms of thinking as the other areas. But they do argue about the issue of focusing on renewable and clean energy, newer energy technologies for sustainable development, on economic growth, and as well as increased efficiency in the use of natural resources that are driven by, work that will be done to improve the environment. And they also support universal access to energy, that all countries must be able to have access, to energy. On the post-2015 sustainable development, on the next slide, they do support the sustainable development financing strategy of the sustainable development goals, the SDGs, and hoping that the ODA should be used as an instrument, for that. And some of the elements that they are proposing for the post-2015, it's really the education for all goal, that it must continue, but it must ensure equitable, inclusive, and quality education and lifelong learning for all. They do support BRICS networking of universities as part and parcel of that, education for all goal. And they also support the ending gender inequality, but making sure that women's rights are respected and that all the issues that are facing young people are also being addressed, given the fact that in many of our countries in the South, we've got a youth bulge, and they do want to see those young people actually having a better life than it is currently. And they want to ensure sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, for all. We all are aware of the fact that there's been so many contentious issues in this area of reproductive health, and it's encouraging to see that the BRICS countries are actually united in ensuring that there is a good policy on sexual and reproductive health as well as reproductive rights. On the question of corruption, which is the next one, they do believe that there has to be an end to corruption, both domestic as well as international, and that it must follow the United Nations Convention on Corruption Rules. On agriculture and food security, basically what they would like to see is that food security should be available for the most vulnerable population, not only in the BRICS countries, but beyond the BRICS countries. They want to see a mitigation strategies of climate change, should be attended to in order to ensure food security. And also to say there has to be some adaptation of agriculture to climate change. We need to come up with some of those strategies. Now, how do they go about implementing these strategies? Now, for this slide, it says for the past 5 years, BRICS was guided by the overarching objectives of peace, security, development, and cooperation. The 6th year of BRICS, they are moving much more towards a comprehensive cooperation, a closer economic partnership in order to facilitate market interlinkages, to facilitate financial integration, to ensure that there's infrastructure connectivity. Some of you are aware of the IT that is being put around, the BRICS countries in order to be able to ensure that there is connectivity that's improved, and also to make sure that there's people-to-people contacts, that they must make mechanisms available for people to be able to move between countries in terms of visa regulations and so forth. Now, with respect to the roadmap for that intra-BRICS cooperation, there were 2 documents that were put in, but they are not available yet in the public domain, but it's one on the BRICS Economic Cooperation Strategy, as well as the framework of BRICS Closer Economic Partnership documents. They were developed, but they were informed by the BRICS Think Tank Council, the BTTC, and the summit leaders instructed that the Sherpas, who are the main contact, administrative contacts across the countries, to advance discussions on this with a view to submit the proposal for the endorsement by the next BRICS summit, which is going to happen in Russia in July, so 2015. So that's important, that the work has got to be done. And then on the BRICS agreement on macroeconomic policy, I just want to say just a few things. That there is a strong commitment to intra-BRICS work and with the world community to foster financial stability, support sustainable and stronger inclusive growth, and promote quality jobs. BRICS itself is committed, to grow the economy. They are committed to work closely with the G20 and work towards a collective GDP by more than 2% above the trajectory that is based on the current policies over the coming 5 years. So they want to play their part in growing the global economy. In moving towards this, they've signed a number of agreements which are going to be helpful towards growing the global economy. One is the agreement on the new development bank. The second one is the treaty on the establishment of a BRICS contingent reserve arrangement, the CRA. And the third one is a memorandum of understanding on cooperation among the BRICS export credit insurance agencies. And the final one is the cooperation agreement, on innovation. I think it's important to know that the NDB, the National Development Bank, as well as the CRA, were negotiated during the tenure of South Africa as the chair of the BRICS summit. Now, I'm going to take you through each one of those 4 agreements in brief. The new development bank has an initial authorized capital of about $100 billion. an initial subscribed capital of $50 billion, which is going to be shared equally among the 5 countries. It has an interesting model of arranging relation, in other words, of coordination of activities. The new development bank is going to be headquartered in Shanghai. And at the same time, there will be the new development bank of the regional center, which is going to be established in Johannesburg. It will be set up the same time as the Shanghai office is being set up. The president is going to rotate, but right now the president will start with India. And the chair of the board of governors will be in Russia, and the chair of the board of directors will be in Brazil. The ministers of finance are given the responsibility to actually develop the model of operation. This is a very good example of democracy in international cooperation because it has win-win outcomes. It says if you are going to make contribution to the pot, you must also have a word, a power to be able to make input. I think that is very good. What's important, it's still on that slide, what's important is that it will be able to pool the BRICS savings, which collectively they have about 4 trillion US dollars to assist those BRICS countries that share the common objectives. So there's a pot of money over time that they believe will be available to be able to assist, development. And South Africa, I must say that is also making a contribution to that. And some may say, well, that contribution, South Africa doesn't have that money. But this is an investment. It's not a question of putting money into expenditure. It is an investment that South Africa can be able to draw upon, just like they do with the World Bank as well as the African Development Bank. On the CRA, they signed a treaty for the establishment of the BRICS contingency reserve arrangement with an initial amount of $100 billion to do 4 things. One is to forestall short-term liquidity pressures that may be experienced by some of the countries, to promote further BRICS cooperation, have an instrument that helps them to cooperate, and to strengthen the global financial safety net, as well as to augment existing international arrangements. The contributions that are going to be made, obviously, China is going to make much more of a bigger contribution compared to South Africa. If China contributes 41 billion, South Africa will contribute, 5 billion. But in terms of access to resources, this is where the concept of equity actually makes sense, in the sense that China will be able to access resources to have a multiplier of 0.5, but for South Africa, it will have a multiplier of 2. And then the other 3 countries will have a multiplier of 1. So, and that's very important. Although there is still quite a bit of work to be done in terms of making sure that this policy is actually ratified in each one of the countries. On the next slide, we've got the BRICS Export Credit Insurance Agency Agreement. There was a memorandum of understanding of that. And there are 5 institutions that have been asked to actually sign this agreement, and they've signed the agreement in order to support and encourage trade and investment within the BRICS countries, in order to promote products and services of BRICS countries internationally, in order to exchange experience in export credit and investment insurance, and in order to share guidelines and regulation on export credit and investment. All these are going to help in the sense that they are going to create harmonization of positions on international guidelines and regulations on export credit and investment insurance. On the next one is the final agreement. The 4th agreement is cooperation agreement on innovation. And there are 5 institutions that have signed up on this, and the South African Development Bank, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA, is also part of that. They've signed that agreement with the hope that they are going to facilitate cooperation on projects and initiatives, and that are going to focus on infrastructure and sustainable energy, including the process and product innovations in the fields related to industry, services, as well as agribusiness. And they will also facilitate the flow of funding directed towards, innovation, projects. Now, this is really good in the sense that it will allow, with this kind of agreement, it will allow for coordination of skills transfer and knowledge sharing, across those countries. Hopefully, they will also be in a position to jointly finance some of the projects. Finally, coming close to the end, as a member of the BRICS Think Tank Council, we are pleased, that the summit has actually endorsed the work of the BRICS Think Tank Council. And I quote, they say, we welcome the BTT study towards a long-term strategy for BRICS, recommendations by the BTTC. We acknowledge the decision taken by the BTTC, taken at its Rio de Janeiro meeting in March 2014 to focus its work on the 5 pillars upon which the BRICS long-term strategy for cooperation will rest. The BTTC is encouraged to develop strategic pathways and action plans that will lead to the realization of this long-term strategy. To that end, the next slide, we have decided to divide up the work amongst ourselves. Russia is going to take on the responsibility for developing developing the action plan for promoting cooperation for economic growth and development. Russia will work on the peace and security issue. South Africa will work on social justice, sustainable development, and quality of life. And India will work on political and economic governance, and Brazil will work on the progress through knowledge and innovation sharing. Now, this work is not just going to be done by the think tank institutions themselves, but is going to draw on academics in each one of those countries and NGOs, as well as some of the people in the business sector, to draw some of those people to work with them in order that we can produce a document which will then be discussed in Russia in July. In conclusion, I want to say that BRICS is now a cohesive group. It's acting in unison in order to contribute to the global agenda based on an alternative social policy. It addresses the question of peace and security, on innovation, on sustainable development. It has resources to be able to finance infrastructure development, and it's creating mechanisms for economic cooperation between and among BRICS, as well as outside of the BRICS itself. And it does, most importantly, rely on academic input to policy making, and I think it is going to take BRICS very far. When the Indian president mentioned it in the Durban summit, that we are going to take serious the work that's coming in from academics. Some of us were doubtful, but when we actually see the declaration that came out from the meeting in Fortaleza, it's very clear that they actually are taking into account the work that's evidence-based. With those words, I just would like to say thank you very much.
Olaf, thank you very much for a detailed report on international public goods considered by BRICS and for the mutual benefit of the countries but also the citizens. Can we have Pretoria, and if there's anybody in Durban, back on the screen, please? The way we're going to do this is that we're first going to go to Pretoria and then to Durban and then to Cape Town. So we're going to do a first round of 5 questions. Can we give 2 to Pretoria, given the number? Please, anyone? Questions, comments?
There's a hand here.
Okay, please identify yourself.
Any other hand? Victoria? 2. Okay.